Hello and welcome to week 2 of the Make Do Create project. Last week we got an overall introduction to animation and a brief insight to how it's made and why we use it as an art form. In the upcoming videos we're going to take a look at different types of animation, this week starting with traditional 2D. In our introduction we already took a look at traditional animation when talking about how it's done, and without going as far back as cave paintings, it's one of the oldest methods that most of us recognise as being animation, so the majority of the overall rules and foundations started there. So what do we mean when we say 2D animation? If you look at these two, you can tell right away which one's which, and if we're asked to describe the difference, you might say one is flat looking. You can see two axes, but not the third. As we checked out before, all traditional animators hand drew these animations one frame at a time. And remember when we said that the frame rate is 24? This doesn't always mean that every second is 24 drawings. In fact, it's common for it to be 12 drawings. This is called working on twos, because you're making a change every 2 frames. If the action is very fast, then you might need to make a change every frame to convey the movement, and so then you'd be working on 1s. And if you have a very slow action, you could work on 3s or 4s. If a character isn't moving, you could hold the same drawing for many frames instead of drawing it again and again in the same place. You can swap about drawing on 1s and 2s and so on. It's whatever works for the best result. This method of traditional animation is lengthy and expensive and is most commonly used to make feature films. With the rise of digital art and computers, you can have 2D animation that isn't the same as traditional, technically speaking. This is what you would refer to as vector-based animation. Images are created in 2D, but they're instead saved as a vector image to be manipulated rather than being drawn over and over. The same principles apply to make the animation look good, but it means that there are less drawings and more of a library of images to pick and choose from. You can even attach rigs to them, so you can sort of move them like a puppet, and then it's a case of saving the position in a keyframe. And you can scroll back and forth along a timeline the same way you traditionally flip back and forth to check your work. This offers a faster workflow and doesn't require expert drawing skills. This method is quicker, cheaper, and more accessible, and so it's commonly found in short TV series, adverts, and web pages. Today we're going to try our hand at a traditional style of 2D animation on an app you can get for your phone or tablet. It's called FlipaClip. It's free, and it can be downloaded on iOS and Android. So once you download the app, this is what the front page looks like. To add a new animation, just click the plus and then the name. You can choose a background. For this I'm just going to stick with white, and you can also check the frame rates. With this I'm going to stick with 12. So I've named my one fishing because today we're going to do a little animation of a character casting a fishing line. And I'm going to draw a little pier as a background just to help set the scene and help us orientate and stage our character. And for this, I'm just using my finger for the whole thing. I have a stylus, but I find that using your finger actually works a bit better. And then just to help get the timing, I'm going to add an audio track. I'm going to make the sound effects of what I think the fishing line will sound like when it's being cast, so all the swooshing noises. This helps with the timing, and it helps us see how many frames we're going to have to draw in advance. And I'm just making the sound effect myself. By clicking the plus, you can add the audio, either record it yourself or you can add music if you need. So as you can hear there, I just made the swooshing sound of the rod casting backwards, forwards, and then the little plop of the bait landing in the water. And now that we've recorded audio, that will show up at the very bottom how many frames that audio is taking up. So in our case it's 33, so just over 2 seconds. And when you scroll back and forth over the timeline, the audio is played at the same time. So what I'm going to do with the drawing on frame 1 is make it a background layer so that we can't interfere with it. So I'm just going to name it and lock it. And if we go up to the top menu and under the frame viewer, since we know that we have 33 frames, I'm just going to copy and paste all the way to 33. This frame viewer menu is a really good one if you need to do any adjustments to multiple frames at a time. I could do this on the timeline itself, but it would take so long because you have to copy paste for each frame. But now we've got as many as we need. And we're going to go into our layers and make that background layer locked. So now when we try to draw on it, it can't be interfered with or changed. And then we're going to go into our second layer, which is laying over the top of the first one, and we're going to make that the animation layer, and that's where we're going to do all of the drawing without having to worry about the background changing. And we're going to keep that layer unlocked. So you can just change your equipment at the side there. There's only 3, but the pen is pretty good and it's all we need right now. You could change the thickness, it goes up by pixels at a time, just for what you're comfortable with and what feels right. So I'm going to start off making this little fisherman character. Just using very simple shapes, rectangles, circles, lines, not even going to do any faces or feet or hands or anything. If you keep it simple, you're going to have a much easier time. And for the fishing rod, just to make it simpler and make it easier to distinguish, I'm going to make it red. You can change and save colours in the little colour bar at the side just below the pen option. Last week we talked about the first 2 principles of animation, squash and stretch and anticipation. We're going to keep those in mind for this animation, but we're going to touch on the next 2, and I'm going to start off with staging. So staging I like to think of as sort of 2 parts, the first being the camera and where we position everything. So here we have a fishing scene. We want to include the fisherman and the water he's fishing in, so we wouldn't put him all the way over to the right because then we'd miss the water and we'd miss the fishing. But we don't want to have him all the way over to the left either. We want to have a space behind him too, because in this animation we're going to have him throw the fishing rod behind him before he throws it forward to cast the line. So we do want to keep that space behind him as well. So the best place for this little guy is sort of in the middle. And the second thing to do with staging is competing actions. There's only one action happening in the scene, which is the fisherman fishing. If we started adding other actions in, they're going to compete for the stage time. For example, if you suddenly had some person juggling come in from the side and then a bunch of sharks appear, our eyes are going to be darting back and forth from one thing happening to the other, and we're going to miss 2 out of the 3 actions happening because they're all overlapping each other. So if you want to have multiple things happening in a scene, of course you can, but you have to give them their own stage time. You can have the juggler come in after the fisherman's cast the line and distract him from the shark that's taken the bait, but it's something that has to happen in a sort of 1, 2, 3 sequence, like you're telling a story. So that's staging. You just have to set up the scene that is the best way to show to the audience what you have happening. There's no point doing all this class animation and having it all overlap each other, so it's not appreciated. So on frame 1 we have drawn our first image, and if we go to frame 2 you will see sort of the ghost of what we've drawn on frame 1 appear, and this is a really handy reference for the next frames and getting your positions right. It's what's commonly referred to as onion skinning. So going back to anticipation, we're going to show this character anticipating throwing the line forward by sort of having him bend forward slightly, bending the knees and sort of crouching a little bit, getting ready to throw this fishing line out. We're just making tiny adjustments each time and sort of paying attention to real life references. When you lean forward, you're going to bend one knee, you're going to straighten out the other, you're going to bend the elbows a bit. And now we're just going to have a very large gap between the last 2 frames where the arms are down holding the fishing line, and then all of a sudden they're being thrown back up because he's casting the line behind him. Leaving a large gap between the 2 drawings like this will give the illusion of speed. So we're not doing the fishing rod at the same time as the character. If we just concentrate on one at a time, it makes it a bit easier. And the fishing rod is basically just drawing a line anyway, so it's easy to add in the end. It's not going to be doing much movement in the initial frames, apart from a little bit of bending, sort of warping up the ways as he's leaning down. And then for the bigger action, it's going to sort of stretch, not so much squash because it's just a line at the moment. It's not a very detailed fishing line, but it's going to have a significant swoop for the arm action coming up here. And just keeping in mind the body position, since he's leaning back with the fishing rod, I'm just going to have him sort of tip back onto one foot at the very peak of him leaning back. If you notice, I'm drawing from the legs and the bottom first. It's because that's sort of where his pivot point and his center of gravity has started, so I like to sort of begin there instead of the head and then have to adjust. I always start at sort of the very center of gravity of the body, and then you can put all the peripheral parts after that. And remember, when we're doing the fishing rod, we want it to sort of bend backwards because it's sort of springy, especially at the very end. So we want to have it sort of bend backwards with the force of him swinging backwards. So I'm just referencing the audio I recorded down here. I know in another 2 frames I'm going to have that second swoop sound. So I want to have a pretty fast action in the next 2 frames. And the previous frames were the anticipation for these next frames where he's throwing the fishing rod forward and casting the line out into the water. So he's sort of gone from his back leg leaning down to his front leg, and now the back leg's lifting off. So the next frame here is going to be the fastest point that the fishing line is, the fishing rod is moving at. So we want to have the most amount of stretch and exaggeration going on here with the bendiness of the fishing rod. And like what we did when he swung the fishing rod behind him, when he swings it fully far forward and it's still, we want to have the sort of very top bounce back into the original straight position. I'm going to talk about the next principle, straight ahead and pose to pose. This is just referring to how you go from frame to frame. So throughout this whole thing, I'm pretty much using straight ahead action, which just means I'm drawing on frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, one after the other. If I was doing pose to pose, I would sort of map out the very main poses, like start, middle, end, and then I would do the in-between poses afterwards. Pose to pose is really good if you have a very specific start and end position, or a very choreographed piece. If I did straight ahead for, say, him jumping into the water, I might get the arcs wrong, or I might end up falling short of the destination. Whereas pose to pose, you can precisely map out the key frames and work on the in-betweens afterwards. So we've got the very beginning of the animation sorted, where he's casting out the fishing line, and for the remainder of this animation, this character doesn't really need to move at all. So what we can do is just count how many frames are left, and then very simply take the lasso tool, kind of like what you have in Photoshop, and just draw around him and then copy paste this little character onto the other frames, and that saves us doing any additional drawing. We don't have very many frames to do this with, but if there was any more than that, I'd go into the frames viewer where we can just copy one and then paste much quicker. It's a much easier way to do multiple things at a time, and we can multi-delete as well. So we've got our fisherman casting out the line, but we haven't got a line or a float yet, so we're going to add that in now. We're adding them in at the end just because it's easier to add in when the very main action is finished. Just like with the fishing rod, we're going to make the float a little different colour and put it on at the end of the line. This is a little ball, so remember when it's being thrown about fast to apply the squash and stretch, stretching it when it's going at its top speed and squashing it when it comes to a stop. And up at the very top, the float and the line are going to be out of frame, but that's okay. We can just anticipate where it would exit and where it would enter into the frame again. If we had a larger scene, we could draw the whole thing, but we're limited to the size that this app gives us. And when the float lands in the water, we can add a couple of splashes and a couple of bobs up and down to make it look like it's floating. The splashes are very sort of organic and you can't really predict or plan them out, so you can just do them at random and it'll be fine. And sort of like the squash and stretch, when we're adding the fishing wire in, it's going to be very taut at the top speed, and then when the float slows down again and hits the water, the line will become a bit more slack. And that's us done. You can check your animation by pressing play and it'll play the whole thing in a loop. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So when you're ready, you can save your animation by clicking the menu at the top and make a movie. It's here you can also change other things like the name, the file type, the aspect ratio, whether or not you want to make a GIF. I'm just going to choose MP4 and share, save to my device. Before we wrap up, the movie recommendation this week is a little more close to home with Song of the Sea. It's got a combination of traditional and vector-based animation in a feature-length film, as well as a really unique and beautiful art style and heartwarming story. And that's us for this week. We went through the third and fourth principles of animation, pose to pose and straight ahead, and staging, whilst also building upon squash and stretch and anticipation as well. Hopefully the FlipaClip app works well for everybody and everybody gets a chance to make their own animations. You of course don't have to copy what I've done. You can explore and do something crazier, longer, whatever you want, and if you do make anything, make sure you share them with us. And subscribe to the Wheelworks channel so you can keep up to date with all of the projects going on there. That's it. See you next week.